Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the June Conservative Women's Network. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Clare, Boothe, Luce Center for Conservative Women. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to the C-SPAN audience as well. We're very happy to be co-hosting now with CPI, the Conservative Partnership Institute, for our CWNs that we hold in DC. And special thanks to Ed Corrigan, there he is, for doing this partnership with us. We're very grateful to you. This year marks the Luce Center's 30th year of preparing and promoting conservative women leaders, using great role models like today's speaker, Cleta Mitchell. And the Conservative Partnership Institute is an outstanding group founded in 2017, a trailblazing conservative organization that trains, equips, and unites conservative leaders in Washington and across the nation to take ground and win. The monthly Conservative Women's Network began 23 years ago. We've been doing this lunch, promoting great women for all of these years. Today's speaker, Cleta Mitchell. She's a friend, she's an incredible leader for our country. Her topic today, what the left has done to our elections and what we can do about it. After being with a major DC law firm for many years, Cleta is now a senior legal fellow here at CPI and is the founder of the Election Integrity Network. She's a licensed attorney in Oklahoma and Washington, D.C., a leader with many, many accomplishments over the years, including standing up to the harassment by Obama's IRS during their targeting of Tea Party groups and many conservative groups like ours. Clare Boothe Luce had a dreadful audit. And she also worked in 2020, well-known, representing President Trump's legal team in Georgia. She's one of our favorite speakers before young women at the Luce Center. She's spoken for us many, many times. She has a wonderful speech. I've been after her to come and give it this summer. It's my favorite Cleta speech for young women. It's called Being Respected is More Important Than Being Liked. That's a great speech. And I'm after Cleta to write a book, too, about that. Things my mama taught me, right? That's right. Cleta was our 2013 Woman of the Year. Every year we pick the best, most outstanding conservative woman, and that was Cleta back then. She also served in the Oklahoma House of Representatives from 76 to 1984, and she ran for lieutenant governor of Oklahoma. She got 48%. She was a Democrat then, but she shifted. That's back when there were good Democrats, you know. She also practiced law in Oklahoma for 8 years before she came to Washington. She received her BA and her Juris Doctor from the University of Oklahoma. She's coming up to her 40th wedding anniversary. She has a daughter, a son-in-law, and a grandbaby now. Life is rich, isn't it? She currently resides in North Carolina with her husband, Dale. Please join me in welcoming Cleta Mitchell.
I tell Michelle that she has more daughters than any mama in America. She has been training and dealing and promoting and inspiring young women for, what'd you say, 30 years now? It's pretty darn amazing. Thank you all for having me. And welcome to CPI, the Conservative Partnership Institute. I was the lawyer who helped, I'm the midwife for CPI. This was my client and help give birth to this wonderful organization. I do want, Ed, would you like to say a word about CPI? Would you like to come forward and say a word about CPI?
Thank you, and thanks for hosting this panel. We started CPI in 2017. We're a service organization. Our goal is to provide support for those in the movement who are doing wonderful things, and thank you to all of you who are here today to learn about some of the amazing things that Cleta has to talk about. But basically, we provide training, coalitions. We help for career advancement for conservatives. And basically anything we've helped to, with Cleta's help, we've helped to incubate a number of new organizations. And so we're trying to be the wind behind people's sails who are trying to fight for the right things in this country. And so appreciate you giving the opportunity.
Thank you.
Well, CPI is a truly amazing organization. So I want to talk today about elections. I'm an election lawyer, and for many years, I mean, that's what I've done. When I was in private law practice, I always said my elevator speech was that I was the consigliere to the vast right-wing conspiracy, and I'm very fortunate in that I've had the opportunity to represent many conservative organizations, advocacy organizations, candidates, Republican candidates, Republican Party committees, etc. And it's about the business and regulation of politics. That's what political law is. And that includes such things as election law, campaign finance law, lobbying law, all of those, as I say, the business and regulation of politics and advocacy and policy. And so in that capacity, I've had the opportunity over the years to be very involved in election law, and I want to talk about that today. I'm trying to cover 5 points. I always believe it's important to tell people so they know when they're looking at your watch, how many more does she have to go? I want to talk a little about the history of election law in America. I want to talk a little bit about the status of our elections today, the sad state of media lack of coverage and misreporting about election issues and election system issues, what the left has done to our election systems, and what we as citizens can do about it. Because I'm a big believer that you don't lay out a problem if you're not willing to talk about how do we resolve it, what do we do about it. And I always mean for everybody in the room to take a task and do it. So a little bit about the history of elections in America. At the Constitutional Convention, Article 1, remember this, we don't often think about this. Article 1 is not about the executive branch. Article 1 of our Constitution is the legislative branch because the founders were mostly dedicated. They were so concerned about making sure that the primary control of our country and of our federal government rested with the legislative branch. The people's representatives in the House, and at that time, the senators who were elected by state legislatures, not by voters. And so but remember as well that this is a federalist system. And so elections, the responsibility for determining the time, place, and manner of elections in America is vested in the states, not in the federal government. Now, there was a concern, and I could give you a whole speech about the history and the politics of the Constitution and the first 10 amendments on. Anyway, it's really fascinating to me, and I spent a lot of time studying that when I was co-counsel to the case on term limits that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I spent a lot of time in the U.S. Supreme Court Law Library studying colony laws and the history of the Constitutional Convention. There was a concern that what if this new Constitution they were drafting was not really accepted by the states? Because remember, they went to Philadelphia to amend, to make changes to the Articles of Confederation, and when they got there, they just wrote a whole new Constitution. So they weren't really sure how that was going to be received, and there was a concern that vesting the authority in the states, solely in the states, to determine how members of Congress or the members of the House were to be elected, what if the states decided, well, we're just not going to do that. We're not even going to have an election. We're not going to elect anybody. So they included in the Constitution a reserved power for Congress essentially to be able to come in and establish a procedure by which the members of the House would be elected in the event that the states didn't do it. So it is a reserved power. It is not a plenary power that Congress has with regard to elections. It's always been the province of the states. And there have been 6 constitutional amendments that have addressed voting and voting rights. The 14th Amendment, which provided that male citizens would have the right to vote, and it does say male. There is the 15th Amendment, which provides for former slaves who were males to have the right to vote, which required the 19th Amendment to say that women would have the right to vote. And then there's the 23rd Amendment, which gave voting rights to the citizens of the District of Columbia, the 24th Amendment that prohibits is a permanent ban on any poll tax, and then the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age nationally to 18. But historically, besides that, there have been very few federal laws governing elections. There are a few. This year, the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA will be 30 years old. The Help America Vote Act was enacted in 2001 following the Florida presidential election of 2000. And of course, we know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was premised on the 15th Amendment, on implementing the 15th Amendment. But historically, it has always been the province of the states to determine the election laws for the states. And one of the things that is really important in my world is to remember that for the last several years, the Democrats in Congress have been trying to federalize our elections, to create a one-size-fits-none, basically, when you really read the bill, to basically turn over the rules and regulations about elections to Congress, which I think is a really terrible idea, as most of the things that Congress decides being a terrible idea, when you want to take power from the states and turn it over to the federal government. Does that mean that I love everything that the states are doing with elections? No, I don't. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's still the province of the states, not Congress. Yesterday, there was a hearing because I want to talk now a little bit about the status of our election systems today. There was a hearing yesterday. It was a joint hearing between the House Administration Committee and the House Oversight and Reform Committee. And it was focused on a provision of law that is being considered, a bill that's being proposed, in the process of being proposed and probably introduced in the next couple, maybe the next month, the American Confidence in Elections Act. And it has a provision, a section addressing elections in the District of Columbia. Now remember, the District of Columbia is the ultimate legislative body for the District of Columbia, is the Congress of the United States. And again, that is part of the U.S. Constitution. And so there was a discussion yesterday, and the topic of the hearing was focused on some serious issues in election administration in Washington, D.C. And I want to share with you just some bullet points, some facts from the opening statement of Brian Stile, who chairs the House Administration Committee, Republican from Wisconsin. Listen to this. These are facts that he presented, which no one disputed, by the way. In 2015, the D.C. Board of Elections sent verification of registration postcards to 260,000 inactive voters, with nearly 40,000 of those returned as undeliverable. In 2015, the D.C. auditor reviewed a list of people who had died the year before. Every single person on the death list was still registered on the voter rolls in D.C. D.C. failed its audit. In 2020, D.C.'s bad decisions continued. During the primary, voters waited in line at some polling places for hours, and some never received their mail-in ballot. D.C. then made the decision to allow voters to submit ballots by unsecured email. In the 2020 general election, the D.C. Board of Elections mailed every person on the registration list a ballot, not an application, a ballot. A post-election audit found that over 11% of the 421,791 ballots sent were undeliverable. That's nearly 50,000 ballots floating around D.C., live ballots that were undeliverable. 2 years later, last year, during the 2020 midterm, 508,543 ballots were mailed, and nearly 90,000 were undeliverable. That's on top of hundreds of voters who were mailed incorrect ballots. Did D.C. work to address those errors? No. They passed a new law recently, which allows voting without a photo ID. It allows ballot harvesting. So if you're a political operative and you know there are 90,000 live ballots floating around D.C., what do you think you're going to do? And there's no way to prevent that from happening under the D.C. laws. And here's my favorite. D.C. law now allows non-citizens to vote. If you've lived in the district for 30 days and you're an employee of the Russian embassy or the Chinese embassy or the any embassy from anywhere in the world, and you've lived in D.C. for 30 days, you can now vote in D.C. elections. We already know that left-leaning organizations, this is from Brian Stiles' comments, accept millions of dollars in foreign money intended to influence American politics. We should all be busy working to stop foreign influence in our elections. But what does D.C. do under their new law? D.C. law makes elections more susceptible to foreign influence. So this is beyond unacceptable. American elections should be for American citizens. Now, what I think is interesting is I watched that entire hearing. I know I'm a nerd, but it's my work, and not a single Democrat on either of the committees asked a question, challenged any of the facts that were presented as problematic that had been presented by the chairman and by the Republican members of the committee. All they did was complain, first of all, that there was even being a hearing to talk about this, and even though Congress has the oversight responsibility for the District of Columbia. And all they talked about was how trying to identify, make them clean the voter rolls once a year. The new bill will require the District of Columbia to clean its voter rolls at least once a year. It will eliminate same-day registration. It will undo the provisions about allowing citizens to vote in D.C. elections and other common sense provisions. But all that was said by any of the members of the minority party, the Democrats on the committees yesterday, all they talked about was how this was suppression, voter suppression, how it was Jim Crow 2.0 or whatever. But just remember that that's what they said about the Georgia law that was passed in 2021. Remember the great brouhaha when Georgia passed a law to strengthen the integrity of its elections following what was a lawless 2020 election, and to ensure that the same problems that had happened in 2020 didn't happen again. And remember, Major League Baseball, all of corporate America went berserk. Major League Baseball moved its All-Star game that was supposed to have been held in Atlanta, and they moved it to Denver, and all they could talk about was it was voter suppression. So fast forward, and guess what happened in Georgia in 2022? It had they saw the highest voter turnout in any election in Georgia history. And a survey that was performed by the University of Georgia following the election asked all voters, did you have a problem voting? Did you experience any suppression, voter suppression or difficulty voting? Would you like to know the percentage of black citizens of Georgia who said, yes, I had problems because of this new law, there was voter suppression, I couldn't vote? Would you like to know the percentage of black voters in Georgia who said yes to that question? Zero. So the Jim Crow 2.0 law that was attacked by corporate America, woke corporations, including Major League Baseball, saw the highest voter turnout, and 0% of black voters in Georgia reported any problems voting. And so that takes me to a third topic I want to talk about, and that is the media and its failures to properly report on the situation, on election-related issues in America today. If you read the national media, and actually all the New York Times wannabe and Gannett papers, local media, you will get a steady diet that those of us who are involved in election integrity, They have named us. They've given us a new name. We are election deniers. We're election deniers. That's a term that they have just thrown out, and that's what they call us. I have never once denied that there was an election in 2020. I know there was an election in 2020. I spent a good bit of time in Georgia studying and working on what had happened in that election in 2020. Here's what I know. There was an election. I don't deny that. It was not a lawfully conducted election. And that is true in state after state after state. I know, because of the work that I did as one of President Trump's volunteer attorneys in the post-election in Georgia, that there were more votes cast in violation of Georgia law and counted and included in the certified total than the margin of difference between President Trump and Joe Biden. And that's because election officials led by the Secretary of State didn't follow the law. And in my view, the legislative code, the legislature, because the Constitution gives the legislature the constitutional responsibility for writing the election laws, and it is up to the administrators of elections to follow those laws. And we identified, our team of lawyers, we identified over 30 categories of ballots that had been cast, votes that had been cast and counted, and that were cast and counted in violation of Georgia law. And there were more votes in that category of illegal votes than the margin of difference. Under Georgia law, as in the case of most states, if there are more votes and you can establish by evidence that there were more votes cast in violation of law than the margin, the remedy is a new election. Well, Georgia was having another election on January 5th of 2021 because they have that relatively, in my view, crazy general election runoff system. And so we filed a 64-page complaint, an election contest under Georgia law with over 1,100 pages of verified affidavits of citizens testifying under penalty of perjury that they had witnessed this violation of law or this violation of law. Or we had either a verified affidavit of a fact witness or a verified affidavit from an expert based on review of publicly available government documents run against the voter records to determine that there were more, that these ballots were cast by people who were not registered properly and thus were ineligible to have been counted. And we filed that election contest on December the 4th of 2020 and did not, that is supposed to be an expedited proceeding. You're supposed to get to court immediately because it's a very short time frame. And particularly in all elections, particularly when you have a presidential election and you have electors that are going to be certified and you're on a pretty fast track. The chief judge of Fulton County, Georgia, failed to appoint a judge to hear the election contest for a month. And literally we received notice on January 4th, which was 2 days before the certification of electors was being taken place in Washington. So people can say what they want about how President Trump lost all of his court cases. Well, he didn't lose ours because he never got his day in court. And so now I hear every time these reporters, and I use that term loosely, and look, I will tell you, when I was in high school, I had decided I was going to go to journalism school. And I had journalism scholarships. I was going to be Lois Lane. You're too young to know who that was. But I guess there have been movies. But I decided after I got into journalism school, wait a minute, I'm too opinionated. I'm too opinionated to be a journalist. Journalists are supposed to be objective. They're supposed to make their personal opinions secondary, and they're supposed to be objective and cover all sides equally. Boy, did I never realize. I changed my major and I ended up going to law school. But boy, did I make a mistake because I didn't realize that in my lifetime that would completely change. And the idea today of objective journalism, we know that is an oxymoron. There is no such thing. And so I could just share with you, I get asked a lot about this, and I've debated about whether I should talk about this because it is the subject of a grand jury, supposedly the subject of a grand jury investigation in Fulton County, being yet another political, my view, political witch hunt being conducted by a partisan district attorney, because I was on a phone call with the president and with the Secretary of State of Georgia on January the 2nd. I think it was January the 2nd. Now, I will tell you, I did not think that phone call was a good idea. And I expressed that view because we had been trying to work with the Secretary of State at that point for 6 weeks to try to get him to understand that there were problems in certain counties with the election, and that he, as the chief election officer of the state, should pay attention and should look into these things. And we kept sending letters. I think we attached either 3 or 4 letters, very voluminous letters, that we had written to the Secretary of State were included in our election contest, showing that we had made a yeoman effort to try to reach out to the Secretary of State. But the thing the media focuses on is a statement the president made during that phone call, in which he said, we just have to find 12,000 votes or some such thing. I didn't say that, but that's what the president said. And so people say, oh, the media and the left-wing crazies, then I repeat myself, that somehow the president was demanding that the Secretary of State manufacture votes to overturn the election. That's the narrative they want you to believe. Well, let me say this, ladies and gentlemen. We'd already found those votes. They were in the public record, in our lawsuit, 64 pages with over 1,100 exhibits. And we had names, addresses of everyone who we believed that, according to the statute and according to the government records, had voted illegally in Georgia in the November 3rd, 2020 general election. We didn't have to find anything. And all we had asked the Secretary of State to do, and all the president was really asking him to do, and we had been offering this for weeks, is to sit down, we'll bring our data. He kept saying, your data is wrong. And we said, fine, we'll bring our data, you bring your data, and if we're wrong, we'll tell everybody. But if you're wrong, you need to do something. And he refused to do that. So, you know, the left-wing media is constantly, they've given us these, they attack us. There are literally, one of the things that I've done since I became the senior fellow here at CPI since 2021, I have been working to help organize citizens across this country to be involved and engaged in the election process. That is something that is envisioned by the statutes of every state. All but one state in this country provide for citizen observers to observe the election process. And in most of the states, they are required to be appointed by the political parties with the idea that the Democrats will watch the Republicans and the Republicans will watch the Democrats, and that's how we'll ensure that it's fair to everybody. And election workers in many states are required to be nominated by political parties. And in many states, they require parity between the election workers appointed by the Democrats and the numbers appointed by the Republicans so that they're watching each other. This is the way the election is supposed to work. But what we as citizens have allowed to happen is the same thing that parents have allowed to happen with regard to their kids and their schools and their school boards. We thought the experts would just handle it. And now we know that we can't do it that way. And so just as parents have become involved in going to school board meetings and really reading budgets and looking at books in the library and curriculum, citizens all over this country are engaged in the election process. And we have a website, whoscounting.us, And we have published the Citizens Guide. I wrote the Citizens Guide to Building an Election Integrity Infrastructure that talks about starting local task forces. Here's what a task force should do. Here's where you can get more information. We have prepared and posted videos, how-to training videos on how to be involved in the election process. And those are also, we call it the Master Class in Election Integrity, and that's also on the website, who'scounting.us. And we have state coalitions and local task forces all over this country where literally thousands of Americans are beginning to become involved in their election process. And all of those people are attacked by the left-wing media as a threat to election workers. They are attacked, even though there's not a single instance that has been reported over the last 2 years of any election observer, poll observer, volunteers. There's not a single instance of an observer attacking or threatening or harassing an election official. Facts don't matter. Facts don't matter. All of these are election deniers, and they're cast solely in negative and pejorative terms. I host every Wednesday, a national working group on cleaning voter rolls. Now, you would think that people would have better things to do than spend an hour every Wednesday to talk about cleaning voter rolls. I have between 120 and 160 people every week on that call talking about databases available to compare voter rolls, what's the best way to organize your task force, how to approach and build relationships with local election officials, and on and on. It inspires me to the point I can hardly talk about it without crying, because these are patriots. They are doing this because they love this country, and they know that if we're going to save our country from all the crazy socialist leftists, we have to save the election system. And so I want to share with you what happened to one of our volunteer in Atlanta, in Fulton County, a citizen who has literally gone through the voter rolls compared in Fulton County, which are a mess, as they are in most major cities in many places in America. And he's found all of these anomalies and dead people on the rolls. And so he has presented that, which was part of the Georgia statute passed in 2021, as challenges. And he's taken the documentation and all. And so somebody complained about him to the local NBC affiliate, because they're pals here, right? So do you think that the NBC reporter reported on this and praised him for spending countless hours paying out of his pocket to pay for databases to use to run the voter rolls and see if there are people who are dead and ineligible on the rolls? No. She ran and did a story in which she came up with yet a new name for people like that. And she would refer, no doubt, to all the people who are on my calls every week as vote fraud hunters. These are vote fraud hunters. And so the media has been absolutely incorrigible about its coverage of this movement that is a citizens movement of citizens across the country trying to help clean the voter rolls. But I think it's important to know about some of these people. I mean, I used to spend a lot of time with reporters because I figured they never talked to a conservative, and so it was my job to be the sole conservative to try to give them a little different perspective. I don't do that anymore, because what I've realized is the days of any reporter for any publication that is considered mainstream, although they're not mainstream, they're completely out of step with the mainstream of America and citizens. They're part of the elite, and they're the mouthpiece for the left. But I want to share with you, you probably think that the Associated Press is an unbiased reporting entity. You would be wrong. And now we're even seeing the evidence of it, which I love, because in about April of last year, the Associated Press announced, let me tell you the headline, AP announces a sweeping climate change initiative. The expansion is supported by several philanthropic organizations, including the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Quadrivium, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, do we believe for one moment that the Associated Press is going to be reporting that perhaps some of the climate change hysteria is not based in fact? But, oh, don't worry. They said when they announced this funding, AP retains complete editorial control of all content. Then in December of last year, AP announces sweeping democracy journalism initiative. AP aims to improve civic literacy and combat misinformation by bolstering its explanatory journalism and providing information and tools to local newsrooms to aid their coverage. Would you like to know who's funding that? The effort is supported by the Lilly Endowment, Inc., Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. If you would like to know more about what each of those foundations fund, go to Influence Watch, influencewatch.org, and you will find that these are not exactly funding places like CPI. That money is going for left-wing organizations and causes. So we deal with that every day. And, I don't even I don't even try to explain. There's no point in talking to an Associated Press reporter because he's on the take from all of these left-wing foundations. But I want to talk now, number 4, I want to talk about what the left has done to our election systems over the last decade and then close with what we can do about it. Over the last decade in particular, the left has, and look, this is not me saying this. I've researched, I've read the articles, I've seen the reports. In January of 2013, there was a gathering, according to Mother Jones, not exactly a conservative media outlet, that talked about a gathering of progressive leaders in Washington to talk about, and they came out with their report, we're going to change the political system of this country. And we're going to raise millions of dollars to do it. And they had 3 primary issues they were going to promote, one of which was to get rid of voter ID laws. That's one of their top 3 main things. They wanted to get rid of voter ID. Later that year, the Obama Justice Department under Eric Holder proceeded to sue the state of Texas and the state of North Carolina to invalidate their voter ID laws. North Carolina first adopted a voter ID law in 2012. It was invalidated. That's a long saga. And ultimately, it was submitted as a constitutional amendment to the people of North Carolina, which passed it by a margin of like 60-something% to have voter ID, and the state Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, even though it was now in the Constitution. And only this year, with a new Supreme Court in the state of North Carolina, has the voter ID law been finally being implemented. And it will be implemented in upcoming elections for the first time after having been enacted originally 12 years ago. But later that year, there was a gathering of according to Politico, lawmakers from 50 states to talk about how they were going to change the election laws. Here are some of the things they wanted to do. They announced they were going to do registration on Election Day, online and pre-registering students, expanding early voting, distributing locations of polling places, including on college campuses, reducing long lines at polling places by offering voting by mail and expanded absentee voting. And basically, all of those, so they set about, and they didn't raise millions, they raised billions. They have one leftist billionaire after another. I want to know where our conservative billionaires are, because we need your help to try to fight the leftist billionaires. We've all heard of George Soros, but Pierre Omidyar, who was a founder of eBay, we know he gave $250 million in about 20 2011, 12 to create something called the Democracy Fund, which created all of these entities devoted to the election space. His primary goals are to fund public journalism, like the Associated Press is now being funded, ProPublica and others, but to help change the election systems. And then, of course, that set the stage because one of the entities created was the Center for Tech and Civic Life, CTCL, which was the receptacle for billionaire number 2, Mark Zuckerberg, who stepped in and gave nearly $500 million to help to change the outcome of the 2020 election, having money flowing from his foundation to the Silicon Valley Community Foundation to CTCL and one other group, which then gave money to election offices, ostensibly because of COVID. But what really was, it was used to gin up the Democratic vote in key Democratic areas in order, such as the 5 Democratic cities in Wisconsin and Fulton County and other, to drive up the Democratic turnout to change the outcome, the electoral vote in those states in 2020. And now we have yet another leftist billionaire, Bill Gates, assisted by a foreign billionaire, whose last name I can't even pronounce, but I can't even pronounce his name. But he's foreign and he's a billionaire, but they have all these billionaires. And they're giving something called the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, $80 million that they're spreading around to election offices to help them better conduct their elections. It would be as if the Kansas City Chiefs had played a game where some boosters in Kansas City brought money in and trained the referees to be better referees at the Super Bowl. Does anybody think that that would be a way to have confidence in their calls during the Super Bowl? No. So we have to reclaim our election system. And the way we do that is citizen engagement. So I'm going to give you some tasks that you can do. There may be polling places on your campus. You should be an observer. You should be a worker. You should sign up to build a local task force. Go to your local election offices. I first got involved, my first task was when I was in law school, and I signed up to be on the absentee ballot board for Cleveland County, Oklahoma, which is where the University of Oklahoma Law School is. And I was a Democrat then, but there was one Democrat and one Republican, and we took this wooden ballot box around to the nursing homes so that they could vote, but there was a Democrat and a Republican, so that you watched each other and you knew that no staffer and no political operative was influencing how that elderly person was voting. We have vulnerable voters in this country, and the left preys upon those people. And we have seen evidence from Wisconsin and elsewhere where they abandoned the statutory requirement for what they call special voting deputies, which is like the old absentee ballot board that I was on in Oklahoma all those years ago, and they allowed people who worked in the nursing homes to help cast ballots for people in the nursing homes in Wisconsin. And those are the kinds of things we need to stop. We need to be there, we need to be watching, and we need to be protecting our election system. And I'll just close with this. This is in our power to do, and we have to do it. And all those patriots out there who are working so hard to help save our elections are heroes and heroines. They're not bad people, as the media would have you believe. Our Declaration of Independence says, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And in our Constitution, the way we as citizens give and withdraw our consent is through elections. And when elected officials, through changes in the laws, through administrative election officials, allow leftist influences to come in and dictate how they conduct the elections, when the election process is put beyond the reach of the voters, we lose that fundamental right to give and withdraw our consent. And that is no longer a constitutional republic. That is then a system that is dominated and controlled by the elites who dictate to us rather than incorporating us in the decision making. And we are headed for that sort of system if we don't stop it. And that is why many, many thousands of people across this country are engaged in the election process. And it's why I urge all of you to think what you can do, what role you can play to help save our elections. And with that, I thank you.
What a fabulous summary, where we are and what we need to do. Thank you so much, Cleta.
Thank you.
Cleta's agreed to do some Q&A. Lindsay has a microphone. If you would raise your hand if you have a question, and if you wouldn't mind, give your name. Oh, hey, Katie, and who you're affiliated with if you are, or if you're an intern, where you go to school.
And I'll also repeat the question so everybody can make sure to hear it.
Okay. So, Katie Gorka. Today I will use my affiliation of Catholics Engaged for Fairfax, so we're working at the local level. I wonder, could you drill down a little bit on the idea of this independent funding, the philanthropic funding, because I know it is such a big problem. Have you all thought about any potential policy solutions to this?
Well, the question is about the private funding, and it's all coming from the left. I mean, it would never dawn on conservatives to go raise money and give it to an election office. But look, I mean, many states, there are 23, actually, I just heard a report yesterday, Louisiana has now, the Louisiana legislature passed a proposed constitutional amendment yesterday, and 23 states have previously passed bans on, in their states, against having election officials receiving private funding. So private funding to election offices that's now banned in 23 states. Soon to be, hopefully hopefully people will adopt that in Louisiana. I don't think anybody who hears about that thinks that's a good idea. I mean, how that you're going to have private groups funding your election system? And it's all coming from left-wing billionaires. And so there are several other states that in 2021 and 22 passed the ban, but it was vetoed by the Democratic governor. Republican legislatures in North Carolina and Wisconsin both passed it, vetoed by the governor. The North Carolina legislature is getting ready to pass it again, and hopefully this time they'll have a veto-proof majority. So that's what that is what citizens across the country are trying to do, is to ban the private funding of election offices by, any private funding from, it's the worst. I just can't imagine who came up with the idea, but I actually do know who came up with the idea. It was an idea, David Plouffe, who was an Obama political advisor, was working for Mark Zuckerberg in 2019. I don't know when he started, but he wrote a book on how to defeat President Trump. And so he came up with a plan, and ingenious it was, to be able to manipulate the election system. It's crazy, but it happened. Yes.
Daniel Brubaker. I'm a school board candidate in Loudoun County, Virginia.
Good for you.
As you know, I also wrote a book on the 2020 election. So
yes.
Thank you for being here. It's good to meet you in person. Consent of the governed. I think many times people think of that as just the outcome of an election, but I've often, as you know, you talked about an unlawful election. The laws of the land that we went through the process of debating, proposing, passing, amending, all these things and getting them into law, those are the expression of the people's consent and the people's self-governance, right? So I think that's just really important to reemphasize that. There's not really a question in that, but
well, no, but that's exactly right. I mean, our founding fathers really believed in the idea that ultimately the citizens control the country, and not the other way around. And when you have election officials who don't abide by the election laws, I mean, I mentioned the special voting deputies in Wisconsin and the statute that requires that you have a Democrat and a Republican together who go. The Wisconsin Election Commission and the administrator, she just said, just ignore that. Just don't pay any attention to that. They used COVID as a pretext for just saying, oh, you know that statute? We'll ignore that. The statute in Pennsylvania that requires matching of signatures on absentee ballots. The Secretary of State sent something out in September of 2020 saying to all the county election officials saying, you don't have to do signature matching because of COVID. Well, I wasn't aware that you couldn't sign your name because of COVID, but it's one of the examples. So they just were lawless. And you're right, when your elected representatives have adopted a statute and you have administrators who just disregard it, then you are eliminating the consent of the governed. Yes.
I'm Abby Hutchinson, and I'm working at Clare Boothe Center for Conservative Women, and I'm going to school at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. And I'd like to ask you, we've seen in Alaska, and I believe Maine as well, ranked choice voting, and I would like to ask your take on it, and if you believe it's unconstitutional.
All right, the question is about ranked choice voting, and actually I conduct a weekly call with leaders from around the country, and we had a presentation this morning from a leader of a citizens group in Alaska talking about ranked choice voting. And interestingly, ranked choice voting is yet another concoction of the left. They have about half a dozen of them. If you want to know a bit more about them, you can go to the website of the Election Assistance Commission. It's eac.gov, and they have a white paper on alternative voting systems. So this is a system that is so complicated. They describe it as instant runoff or some such thing. If you want to have a runoff, have a runoff. But you go in and you try to decide and you vote for this person or that person on the ballot. What ranked choice voting does, and it's now the law in New York City, it's now the law, it was enacted by ballot initiative in Maine and in Alaska, both inexpensive states for purposes of doing that. And the one in Alaska was buried under it had several, you're supposed to only have one topic, one issue, but they had several on it. It was buried under a get rid of dark money was the campaign. They never mentioned what ranked choice voting, but it is where you go in and you vote and you rank all the candidates on the ballot. You have to rank all the candidates on the ballot. So it would be like saying you're for the Republican, but you have to rank where you put the Democrat. You maybe put the Democrat last. But if you say, well, I don't want to vote for 5 people, I just want to vote for my candidate. So guess what happens? If nobody gets 40%, or maybe it's in some cases, if nobody gets a majority on the first ballot, then they run them through again. And so they keep going through and whoever, when you get to, so let's say that you are putting people, you put the people you least like at the bottom. If you don't put anybody but one candidate after the first ballot, you're not voting anymore. Your ballot is discarded. So you now have no voice. You've cast your ballot for your favorite candidate, and now your voice isn't heard any further. And the same is true if you say you only vote for 3, you don't like these other 2, you wouldn't vote for them on a bet, get past the third ballot, you're not heard anymore. So these discarded ballots are pretty problematic. But they just keep running the numbers, running the ballots through with your second, third, fourth, and fifth choices, and then come to, and when somebody finally gets a majority. So if you look at the results, and let's see if I can remember this exactly, but Alaska now has a Democrat in the U.S. House of Representatives for the first time in 50 years. And Red Alaska now has a legislature that's basically evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. So is it any wonder that there is massive left-wing funding for ranked choice voting, and they're pushing it in every state? I heard a report this morning that there may be a constitutional amendment referred to the people of Oregon for having ranked choice voting. I'm worried about the electoral votes from Alaska next year. Historically reliable red state. Not those 3 electoral votes, in my view, are up for grabs. And it's no surprise that Maine, that used to have 1 Republican and 1 Democrat in the U.S. House, now has 2 Democrats. So look, it's a convoluted way. It's hard enough to get people to vote. One of the things that's happened, a couple of things that's happened, it takes months, weeks to go through and all these rounds and rounds of voting. And in Oakland, California, in a school board election last fall, somehow there was a programming error and the wrong candidate was elected under ranked choice voting. And so it's a nightmare, and there's been a precipitous drop-off in voter participation in Alaska, as reported by people there, that reliable voters have just checked out and have not participated because of the complexity and the difficulty of utilizing this ranked choice voting system. And the Supreme Court of Alaska ruled that the guidance given by the state election officials was incorrect. And that's just been within the last 6 weeks or so. But man, we are fighting it everywhere because it is popping up everywhere. Minnesota's in the process of considering it. It was on the ballot in Nevada in 2022, 2022. It's going to be on the ballot again, and they have to pass it. It has to pass one more time. So it's a very real threat, and it's utter chaos. And how people can say that they care about voter turnout and participation and then turn around and support ranked choice voting is beyond me, because it is designed to get people to just throw up their hands and not participate.
One more, Cleta?
One more question?
Last question?
Hi, my name is Cleta Mitchell. I go to Clemson University and I'm an intern at the Clare Boothe Center. Thank you so much for speaking today. So, what are some of the best points to explain the detrimental effects of unlawfully conducted elections to those who think that they can't do anything on a federal level, or that on a state level it won't make that much of a difference?
Well, I will just tell you this. I don't think God lets us get discouraged. Even when we want to be, I don't think we're allowed to do that. All elections take place at the local level. Every election takes place at the local level. And citizens can have a lot of influence if they are engaged at the local level. And I'm going to come back to the question about this leftist billionaire funding of elections. There were a number of jurisdictions around the country that were announced to great fanfare by this U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. You know, about here are grantees, all these great locations that are going to get our grant money. And citizens across the country in those localities, they start showing up at the local election office saying, we actually don't like the idea of getting money from private sources into our election office. And there were a number of those offices, even in California and elsewhere, who said, okay, never mind, and return the money. And so we're not going to take the money. And it's citizens involved in going through voter rolls and going through attending election offices. There are people who have suspicions about the voting machines. Well, there is logic and accuracy testing of every piece of voting equipment in every county. It's required by law. We need to have people who are knowledgeable about technology. I would not be the person to send to logic and accuracy testing, but I know people I do want to go there and watch and make sure and ask the right questions. But I guess what I would say is to people, if you care about the future of this country, you pick the issue you care the most about. I don't care what it is. If you don't protect the system of voting, then every issue that we care about will fall. And all we have to do is look, understand something. I was a Democrat. I cut my political teeth as a Democrat. I understand it. I once wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal that said, for the left, the golden rule of politics is he who writes the rules wins the gold. And so that is why the left is always about writing rules. And so they set about 10 years ago to rewrite the rules for conducting elections in America, and they have largely succeeded. And so we saw it manifest itself in 2020. And look at the policy outcomes since then. They say, yay, just what we've been trying to do. We say, oh my gracious. So if we want to fight the battles, where the battles need to be fought, we better be involved in the election system, the process, because we need to be writing rules. We need to be there when the rules are written. We need to be asking questions. We need to be watching. We need to be involved. And thankfully, our Constitution gives us the right to do that. Now, believe me, there are people, I can show you the news clips for the last year and a half, attacks on me because I had the temerity to conduct training and having meetings, inviting citizens to say, come in and let us train you on how to be involved in the elections. Front page of the New York Times, I mean, all of the left-wing outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, all of them. And, you know, because somehow this was a threat. Well, no, it's not a threat. This is what we do in America. We organize, we get involved, we get engaged. We have a right to do that. And we have a statutory provision in every state about being observers. So, but we can't let that stop us. We cannot let them make us discouraged, and we can't let them deter us because we have a country to save. And I urge you all to get involved doing that. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Cleta. Thanks so much to CPI for partnering with us on this. I have a couple of special gifts for you, Cleta. This is your Clare Boothe Luce ball cap for your walking and your exercising.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
And here's a book I wrote. You could have written it, How to Raise a Conservative Daughter.
That's
But
great.
maybe you can share it with her.
I will.
It's about what we've learned from these wonderful young women we've been working with for 30 years.
It's great. I've
Especially
read
for
it.
parents.
It's wonderful.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
Okay, you can give it to your daughter.
I will. I'm going to see them next week. So.
Wonderful. Thank you
Thank you all
so much.
so much for coming.
Join us for lunch next door.
Thank you.